one area I have to admit is kind of murkier is when you're working with someone who is considered a major innovator and who can boost pretty much anyone up to a high level of importance. Take like the Musks, the Jobs, or the Bezos. Better example, Zuckerbergs of the world. Um, it's a bit easier, or it's a bit harder to separate those because you might have a team of innovators and inventors working under one well-established and I guess creator. So what do you think there's much of a difference in that sense?
I think that in principle there is a difference, but I think that in practice there isn't. I think that it still works as a cohesive unit. Or I think that the whole the whole thing that makes a team work is this cohesiveness. And so I personally, I would still look at it as a unit. I think that you can zero in on specific improvements that were made by maybe different committees that were part of this team, smaller teams within a team. I think you can look at specific improvements made by those people. I think that a team can sometimes be made up of a bunch of groups, right? So I think you can look at the specific units that make up this team, but overall, I would still look at them as a unit. What do you think, though? Because it is definitely a more difficult topic.
Yeah, no, you you completely brought me around. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In like theory, it's different when you're working with someone like as famous or as influential as a Zuckerberg, as a Musk. But in practice, you're still producing a product, and you're not going to buy a Tesla and it goes, this part was developed by Dave, and this
Precisely.
part was influenced by Musk. There's no like real practical difference, as you pointed out. And that becomes even truer when you're dealing with the faceless corporations that a lot of those people work under. So Tesla's not going to produce a product where you can tell who made what. Um, Amazon is not going to release a new system um, that you can tell where the innovation came from. Um,
Exactly. Yeah. Like from more personal example, my mom was a director at Apple in like learning and development. So her team created the trainings, like all the product trainings globally. But you're not going to walk into an Apple and they're not going to tell you about a device and go, oh, this training was created by Shalina Pabani, right? It's just Apple. So the team almost becomes an inventor as a whole, right? And I think that Apple is the inventor, and there's not an Apple that's creating everything, right? There is a team under this sort of label.
yeah, there's a lot of bunches of creativity in that one faceless organization, but as you pointed out, the products don't have faces. And to add another personal example, my dad worked pretty high up at Amazon for a while, and he developed like a system actually for the Amazon employees to boost productivity. But you don't see that on the Amazon.com website. That none of that it is visualized by the consumer. So we can't really, or we can't place innovation, especially among the famous companies. Speaking of famous companies, let's take AT&T for an example. Um, it originally created by Alexander Graham Bell, the company has undergone massive amounts of change. So how much can we credit to Bell for the modern AT&T? Can we even credit him at all?
Personally, I think that it almost goes back to the Gutenberg and printing press discussion. I think that perhaps this was more radical change, but I think that every change that was made, every sort of new invention or new iteration of AT&T was built on the foundation that was created by Bell. So I think I would go back to the Gutenberg printing press discussion
Hmm.
for this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even harder on this time around to credit Bell for this, because though um, it's harder and easier in two ways. So it's harder because you don't have that, as far as I'm aware, that time pressure. You didn't have Gutenberg influencing Martin Luther the same way Bell would influence the society at the time. There wasn't really a necessity for that invention at the time, I would argue. But it is also easier in a way, because I would argue the telephone is a bit more of a radical invention than the printing press. I would argue Gutenberg um, probably innovated the idea from what he, or for at least if he soared in Asia, he probably innovated that idea. Whereas for Bell, there wasn't really any telephones around. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I would argue that the science of the telephone is a bit more difficult to um, say that, oh, it would have come out. It's easy to invent. It would have come up pretty soon after.
Yeah, I think that I personally I see a lot of similarities between this and the Gutenberg discussion. I think that it is a lot more blurry. Um, we have a final product that is very different from the original product, and we also, like you were saying, um, we're not sure if we can really credit Bell because of this difference. But I would go back to that discussion on foundation. I think that um, any product that has such a strong foundation in one singular inventor, I do think that inventor should have credit. And I think that if we go back to the previous example where you have a team, right, and that just gets the credit for this one inventor's, invention, I think that all the people who have worked on AT&T over the years and years and years kind of, again, act as this cohesive unit that we're sort of evolving a foundation created by Bell.
Yeah, I think you're right. Also, it's not really fair to all the people who worked to get AT&T to where it is today to just say, nah, it's not you guys, it's all Bell. Um, so yeah, I mean, in that sense, I think you're right, and I also think it's interesting that we're beginning to see a pattern here. When the product doesn't change, for instance, when what we see in art, um, it seems to be that the original creator is a bit more we view as a bit more impactful. But when that product is changing, like we see in business, like we see in Gutenberg's press, we tend to find more impact in the invention itself. Um, Actually, come to think of it, do you think that could be partly, at least, because that invention is still important enough to continue developing and continue asking for innovation? Do you think that could be part of the reason why?
I think that when we're dealing with complex inventions, you're always going to need some form of foundation, right? I think with a simpler invention, you can pull it out of thin air, but when you're dealing with something as complex as telephones, right, and the science behind those, you are pulling from a bunch of previous inventions that were more simplistic. So I think that as those inventions are improved more and more, you're creating more complex inventions. So I think that that's why we're seeing a larger impact, because we're increasing complexity, right? As technology progresses, it's a culmination of inventions and improvements that were made to pre-existing inventions, but you're increasing its complexity and its impact.
Yeah, I mean, what a lot of what we have today is just this big bowl of innovation. Like the computer I'm talking to you right now on, there's a whole lot of innovation that went into that, and a whole lot of separate inventions that was part of this. Um, but when you look at art, it's or other like less changeable or less malleable inventions, it becomes a little harder. Like, yes, you have some ideas, but a lot of the ideas of the Mona Lisa were unique to Da Vinci. A lot of those techniques Da Vinci used, he created himself. Um, so yeah, I guess there's a few good reasons why those that um, tend to form and mix with other inventions and innovations tend to be more important than the things that kind of stand on their own or don't change as much. But there's one last example I want to cover to put that kind of theory or hypothesis, I guess, to test. So let's examine historical documents. And one we're probably both pretty familiar with is Constitution. So in this case, who do you think I would, who would you say the inventors and the invention is?
I think the invention is clearly the Constitution, and I would say that in this case, the inventors or the inventor were the framers, right? Was this group, this this unit? I do think that they obviously got plenty of ideas from Locke, so I think that that's pulling from an invention, pulling from an inventor, using that um, as a foundation to create this document. But I would still credit them as the framers as the original inventors.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. They took a lot of ideas from Locke, and a few other thinkers. Um, but what's interesting about this example, to me at least, is that it's got the unchanging nature, for the most part at least. There's been relatively few changes to the Constitution since it was created. Um,
For better or for worse.
better or for worse. um, but there's been relatively few changes to it, similar to the Mona Lisa or other art pieces. But it's also got that amalgamation of ideas that we see in business. So I think this is a bit more of an interesting example because we kind of have to question how much credit do we want to give to Locke versus how much credit do we want to give to the fathers?
I think that Locke's credit should be for Locke's invention, personally. And I think that Locke's invention was used in such a way as to create the Constitution, right? Locke didn't create the Constitution. He created principles that were, manipulated to create the Constitution, but he didn't really have any hand in creating the Constitution. So I would still place, personally, I would place the um, I would say that the framers were the inventor, and again, I think that they built their foundation off of Locke's ideas and other thinkers' ideas. Um, but they were the ones who really did create the Constitution. I think if you want to get into the discussion of which is more important, the framers or the Constitution, that's a much murkier topic. That's a much murkier question. But what do
Yeah.
you think? Which do you think is more important?
Well, first off, to get onto your prior point, I agree. Credit Locke where he deserves credit. But the founding fathers succeeded where other nations had failed. They established one of the earliest democracies, and with the Constitution, and that's something that should definitely be respected. Um, so, and you're right. I think this is murkier for a few reasons, and one of the biggest ones that come to mind is that it's difficult to say that the Constitution um, would have just come along later. Oh, someone else would have invented it. Um, Not really, right? We've seen a few constitutions created that didn't work out, and we've also seen a lot of constitutions that came after the American Constitution um, that were just based off the American Constitution, because that Constitution that we have is generally speaking held up pretty well. So I think it's harder to say, oh, someone else could have done it as well.
Yeah, no, I think the document was revolutionary. So in this case, personally, I would put more stock in the invention. I think that the inventors were brilliant in their thinking and their foresight, right, to create a document that has transcended time so well. But I do think that the document itself is revolutionary and has inspired so many other countries and unions to reevaluate their own ideas and goals. And I think it also says something that it's the largest democracy that had ever been made. Not necessarily the earliest, right? I mean, we have, the Greeks and we have many democracies that existed before, but it was by far the largest, right? So to create a document that really could encompass that change is personally, I think, important.
Yeah. I might actually differ with you here a little bit because I think you're putting a lot of personification on the Constitution. And I would argue actually that the Constitution wasn't the one who did all that. I would argue it's the founding fathers being able to synthesize the ideas that came before into an effective governing document that has lasted so long. We can't really credit the piece for lasting so long when it was the creators who made it so well.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you on that. Um, yeah, I think that the Constitution was revolutionary, but you're right. It was the thinking of the framers. It's really just their thoughts. It's very similar to our Da Vinci discussion, where it was the actual psyche and thoughts of the inventor sort of manifested in their invention, which hasn't exactly changed. So actually, you know what? I changed my. Yeah, no, you're right. You're
Feel
right. You're
free to
definitely.
disagree, man.
No, I mean, I definitely think that the Constitution itself, when we think about it now in modern times, we still learn a lot from it. But I do think you're right. I think that when what we're learning from it is we're studying the thoughts and psyche of the inventors in contemporary times. So no, right on.
At least according to my hypothesis, and not necessarily yours, because I'm kind of forcing it on you. Um, but does this break our hypothesis that the more change a document under, or the more change the invented undergoes, the more likely it's had more impact than the original creator or inventor?
In my opinion, no, because I think when we look at this invention, the Constitution, it hasn't gone through many iterations. You know, the Constitution was created and it's still almost entirely intact today. We have the Bill of Rights, which was added, but that was, you know, sort of an add-on. Wasn't a redrafting; it was more an addition,
Yeah.
right? So I think that it has gone through very little change. Certainly not as much change as AT&T or the printing press. So I think it still fits in line with that hypothesis. And I see the same trend. So I completely agree with your hypothesis thus far. I saw the same sort of connections.
Cool. Well, I'm glad we've kind of come to, don't want to say a universal rule, but some kind of trend at least. But it's this time of the video that I want to invite you, the listener, to consider for yourself. Do you agree with that hypothesis? Do you think there's something else that we're missing? Can you give us some other examples that you think maybe prove or disprove our hypothesis? We'd love to hear from you. And even just thoughts outside of that. Let us know in the comments below. And thank you so much, Aden, for joining me today. It was a pleasure to have you.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for watching, and see you next time.